afternoon, friends and colleagues, and our esteemed panelists who come from various parts of the African continent. On behalf of the Institute for Pan-African Studies, A Thought and Conversation, I want to warmly welcome you to the book launch of the publication entitled From Ivory Towers to Ebony Towers, Transforming Humanities Curricula in South Africa, Africa, and African American Studies. I want to extend a special welcome to you on behalf of the Pan-African Institute Director, Prof Ade Adebayo, and a big welcome also to all of you who have joined us today. This publication was produced over a period of 2 years, supported through the Carnegie Foundation, and brought together a group of esteemed and high-level scholars from South Africa, from the Pan-African context, and African-American scholars. During this time, we debated and deliberated over various issues related to curriculum transformation and change in South Africa and in the rest of the world. I just want to say a bit about the book before I hand over to the esteemed panelists. So this book has provided a set of overarching themes and cases from South Africa, Africa, and the African-American contexts. I think the big thing for us was that the volume highlighted the fact that transformation efforts within higher education are part of ongoing struggles between civil society and political formations, which have different interests and negotiate change in the context of often contradictory relations, different values, and conflicting perspectives over the redistribution of resources, power, and knowledge generation. I think, as the book illustrates, the conditions and strategic direction in higher education were established without a deep understanding of the post-colonial state in Africa. In South Africa, the Knowledge Project, as we saw during the student protests in 2015 and 2016, and subsequently, which is the subject of the cover of the book, with the Rhodes Memorial being brought down, that the Knowledge Project remained largely untouched, and colonial legacies persisted, as convincingly argued by several authors in this book. In other parts of Africa, schools of thoughts emerged, challenging colonial paradigms. The Ibadan School of History, the Dakar School of Culture, the Dar es Salaam School of Political Economy, as well as curriculum transformation projects in Ghana, Kenya, and Uganda. And that is, in fact, the topic of our discussion today. As in South Africa, in the US, the approach was one of assimilation into dominant knowledge frameworks with little regard for indigenous knowledge systems, oral traditions, culture, and difference. As we witnessed here and in the US and in the rest of Africa, the response was one of struggle and agency around ideology, the forms of knowledge creation and generation, and the purpose of education and national development. This gave rise to African and African-American scholarship as seen in the Howard and Atlanta schools, with a focus beyond education transformation to include societal change. As we worked through the book, what emerged was that that struggle was a dominant theme in this book through political praxis, contestation around ideas, and transition. While there is a vast literature on Western epistemological, theoretical orientations in higher education research, this makes an important and original contribution to a different type of scholarship in terms of its creativity, originality, and in the manner in which it fuses indigenous knowledge systems and new forms of knowledge. In the post-apartheid, in the post-independence era, African tertiary institutions were caught, as we continue to be caught in South Africa and in other parts in the global South, in the tension between global and national priorities. As we know, the national priorities include redress, equity, access, and the global priorities continue to include global competitiveness, high skills, and the demand for the knowledge economy. The insights that emerged from this book may be summarized under 5 headings: transformation, developing agency, the role of African scholarship, making knowledge accessible, and implementing change in African American studies. So by way of conclusion, I just want to signal some of the big things that emerged from this book, which I hope will encourage you to go out and get the book, but most importantly, to read the book and use it to inform your discussions and debates in your faculties and in your differing contexts everywhere. So the themes that we considered and which we spoke of a lot were the issue of transformation and what this meant. And this was enhanced by the rich cross-continental analyses. The other was the dominance of the Western episteme, its hegemonic and stronghold nature, and the extent to which it can provide a platform to engage in genuine transformation and how constraining this is. And obviously in the South African context, this has led to all the debates around decolonization and the decolonial turn. The other was about knowledge and whether all forms of knowledge are equal and whether the equality of knowledge knowers and where it provides the basis of dialogue between knowledge and what is required for democracy. Others raised the issue of the university-society nexus, the purpose of the universities, who owns the knowledge that it generates, and obviously, finally, and most importantly, the issue of curriculum transformation and whether knowledge and whose knowledge is privileged and whether African voices is a sufficient condition for this transformation. So without speaking much further, I'm now going to hand over to our esteemed panelists. And I want to start off by introducing each one of them in turn. I'll introduce all of them and then we will continue with the presentations. So our first presenter is Pamela Kanakawa, and she is a lecturer in the Department of History, Archaeology, and Heritage Studies at Makerere Universities in Kampala, Uganda. Her current research project focuses on the dilemmas of survivors of landslides and mudslides in eastern Uganda. Our second presenter is Prof Samba Mbub, and he is an associate professor at the Center for Diplomatic and Strategic Studies and the head of Department of Language and Culture at the Pan-African Cultural and Research Institute, both in Senegal. He was formerly as an ambassador to Southern Africa between 2001 and 2006, and he has held various illustrious positions. Our last presenter is the esteemed Professor Toyin Falola, and he is a university distinguished teaching professor and the Jacob and Francis Massacre Chair in the Humanities at the University of Texas in Austin in the US. He is currently working on 20 handbooks and holds a number of distinguished positions, over 20 Lifetime Career Awards, including the Distinguished Africanist Award awarded by the ASA in the US. I want to now hand over to Prof Pamela to begin her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samba. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning for some of our colleagues. It's very humbling for me to be here to share, to talk to my chapter in the book. All right, so my chapter really focuses on the attempted transformation at Makerere University, and I focus specifically on the history department. And just very quickly, I want to say that Makerere was established as a technical school that focused on technical and vocational education way back in 1922, but that it introduced the teaching of the humanities in the 1940s, history specifically in the mid-1940s, and that in 1949, it entered a special relationship, as it was called, and then with the University of London, that basically determined the curriculum, determined the recruitment of faculty, and awarded degrees. So it was until the 60s, or 1963 in particular, that Makerere then transformed into the University of East Africa. And so what we see during that decade is more efforts at Africanization in different ways, whether in terms of staff or in terms of curricula and even research. So in 1970, it becomes an independent national university. And so in that period, perhaps I could, I could talk more about Ugandanization in a way. So in looking at attempts at transformation and Africanization, I borrowed Becky's argument that we can look at this in terms of the curriculum transformation, recruitment of staff, and promoting of African-oriented research. And my argument is that unlike a couple of other African universities like University of Nairobi, which came in much later, even the case at Ghana and even Ibadan, the transformation process at Makerere was rather gradual. So very quickly, if I look at the area of recruitment of staff, we can see that in 1960-61, Makerere had 91 expatriates and just 6 Africans. And then 61-62, it had 93 expatriates and 9 Africans, constituting about 8.8%. And then 1962-63, it had 110 expatriates and just 16 Africans. And of course, the percentage here increases because then that is about 12%. And then from 1963, when it's transformed into the University of East Africa, the expatriates were at 111 and the Africans were still at, were just at 23, which had gone up to about 17%. And so what we see efforts coming from Principal Bernard de Bansen then, at 1962-63, who would argue for the importance of transformation in staff, especially emphasizing that they needed to employ African staff, both administrative and academic. But the emphasis was on, merit and quality. It's not just enough to bring in African staff, but that they needed people who are actually qualified to do so. And so to promote this, to promote the sort of Africanization of staff, the Rockefeller Foundation funded what they called a special lecturership scheme, which was to promote, the appointment of African staff. And then within the same decade, there are more Africans that were appointed to administrative positions. So beginning with Yusuf Lule, who becomes the first Ugandan principal in 1963. And then we had names like Senteza Kajubi, Ali Mazurui, Joseph Lutwama, Savia Wandira, who were appointed to key administrative positions within the university. And there was an encouragement of recruitment of local staff. So by 1971-72, Ugandans held 145 positions out of the total establishment of 438 positions in the university. And so it is clear that the number of Africans or even Ugandans that was still a little bit on the lower side. And the government was, took effort to appeal to government to fund staff development so that they would be able to employ more African staff. But then, of course, things changed drastically once, there was a change of regime, 1971, and so many things changed. So perhaps what we see is that some of the people who were actually supported by the government to go for further studies so that they could come back and fill the manpower gaps, end up not coming back because of the conditions, but so a few of them returned and served the university. But I think the point here is that the change of government then affects the possibilities, the new possibilities for new stuff. And so if I focus on history, history as a discipline at Makerere University, I did say, so the teaching begins in the 1940s, but it was entirely, the curriculum was entirely European oriented until 1951, when Kenneth Ingham was appointed to lead the department. And he takes the first initiative to introduce an African-oriented course, which was a history of tropical Africa. And along the way, he recruits or hires more professional historians who were working, who at least did some research in Uganda, but they were largely from Europe. And so it's the end of 1949 that, it's 1959 that he hires our renowned historian, Bethel Ogot, to an assistant position. So Ogot becomes the first African to be employed in the history department. And that was before he went on to do the PhD. So Ingham, I think the key points about Ingham for me is the introduction of African-oriented courses, but also he went ahead to do research and write about Uganda. So his first book coming out in 1958, which was The Making of Modern Uganda. Of course, this book was largely focused on the colonial period. And even the kind of history courses that he introduced, were said to have largely focused on the activities of Europeans in Africa while ignoring the African voice. And so about 1962, Ingham leaves, and then he's succeeded by Bichi. And under Bichi, it's been observed that there was a decline in African-oriented courses. And so Bichi hires Africans, Semakula Kiwanuka and Faraz Mutibwa. And so what we have now is more Africans in the department, but in terms of the course, there's actually a decline in African courses. But later I figured out that Kiwanuka was actually interested in introducing pre-colonial histories that were very specific to the Buganda region within Uganda. But this is not captured in the chapter because this is something that I gathered much later. And so we have that gap. So Bichi, and then after Bichi, we have Kiwanuka for a short while. And then in 1968, J.B. Webster comes in from the University of Ibadan. And he came in with all the energy to seek to transform the department. So there was a lot of emphasis on postgraduate work during his time. And he emphasized studying Uganda's past, relying majorly on oral traditions, oral histories, and also focusing on histories of decentralized societies which had long been neglected. So during his time, Webster introduced what was called the History of Uganda project. And this involved students at different levels participating in research throughout Uganda. And I just want to say students in history. And so, students were acquainted with the techniques of researching and writing history. And one of the objectives that he argued for was the need to renew within students the bond of affinity with their society and create respect for the knowledge of the elders. So that Africanization and trying to get into the deep past of Africa was I think really, really critical. And in a way, it was building on works of Semakula Kiwanuka, who had also been trained by Roland Oliver at SOAS, and he had written his own dissertation using the same methodology of reliance on orality. And so this marks—
2 minutes left, 2 minutes.
Thank you. So this marks a kind of shift from the 50s and early 60s when researchers entirely relied on government records or archives to write history, to a period when people are now focusing on oral sources. And so again, Webster also promoted these, graduate studies using his influence, he was able to get fellowships for students for Ugandans to go and study in different parts of the world. And also he promoted staff exchanges, especially with the Makerere and the University of Ibadan. So I would say that from the Ugandan case, what I can say is that transformation is a deliberate political project, but the historical context really counts. And to me, I see the political will being a key thing, because from the case of Uganda, I can see that the people who try to move things a bit, in this case, Ingham and Webster actually had very close political connection to the authorities. And lastly, I would just say that you don't need to be an African to transform the curriculum. At least that is what I get from our own case in Uganda. Thank you very much for listening in to me.
Thanks very much, Prof. Pamela. That was relevant and good. And I felt as though there was a whole set of discussions that needed to continue, particularly where you ended. I now want to introduce Prof. Samba Buri, who will now be the next presenter. Thanks very much. Over to you. And I know you have a presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much. So basically, thank you very much for inviting me, first to contribute to this book, and secondly, to be part of this event to launch the book. So basically, my paper, which is chapter 15 of the book, is about Dakar School of Culture, Thought, and Scholarship, which is structured around, essentially focused on Cheikh Anta Diop's contribution to Africology as an alternative paradigm for knowledge production and application, with implications for the transformation of humanities and curricula. The focus of my paper, as I said, would be on the Dakar School of Thought and its contribution to the endeavor for which this book was published, meaning the transformation of curricula and humanities. The Dakar School is an intellectual and cultural capital in Africa and in the world, marked by the permanence and vibrancy and rootedness in a spirit of Pan-Africanism and openness to the global world, with a number of cultural institutions that have been established as well, both learning institutions, but also cultural institutions, a milestone away from Dakar by the likes of Aïkwe Arma, Gérard Chenet, Moussa Sen Absa, Eliman Khan, etc. It is characterized as elsewhere in Africa by the sources of knowledge generation and application. The first one is a Western-inspired space. The second one, actually, that is the first one, is the pre-colonial space of indigenous knowledge systems, which are called the African space of knowledge production and application. And the third one is the Arabo-Muslim and Ajami space, Ajami being literature and knowledge produced using Arabic writing system, but adjusted to write, adjusted to the phonetism of African languages. So we have these three spaces. Now, my first point is about stakes and challenges of higher education in Southern Africa and Africa, but we all know about them, so I would not bother you with that. I would only insist on one aspect as far as Southern Africa is concerned, is a relative epistemic insularity. That is meaning that South Africa is a little bit outside of some mainstream discussions or theoretical trends as a result of the still pervasive dominance of apartheid and post-apartheid epistemologies and the omnipotence of white gatekeepers helped by the Black process. I'm using here the terminology of Sithole in her publication, in 2009 that is also well known. In such a context, peer reviewing, as emphasized by Sitole, is undertaken as a gatekeeping activity. Giants, intellectual giants like Achima Feje, Eskiam Pashlele, Mazizi Kunene, Bernard Magubane, being treated rather as artifacts than scholars, meaning that they are not taught, they are not part of the curricula of the readers, etc. And that is one of the problems that needs to be tackled on. Second point, Sheikh Anta Diop and Africology. Sheikh Anta was a Pan-Africanist who received a multidisciplinary training in humanities, social and exact sciences, in history, linguistics, anthropology, Egyptology, philosophy, but he was first and foremost specialized in nuclear physics, having established in that capacity and managed until his death on 7th February 1986, the radiocarbon laboratory for dating of archaeological and paleontological artifacts, where other radiometric messages, such as potassium argon, were also used, thus making absolute chronologies possible in dating. So this is about the intellectual profile of Sheikh Anta Diop. His work was indeed a very relevant work, scientifically speaking. I will quote his outstanding contribution to the Cairo 1974 colloquium convened by UNESCO to define the methodology for the writing of the general history of Africa. And the theme of the colloquium was the population of ancient Egypt and deciphering of Meroitic writing system. In the general conclusion that was compiled by Professor Jean Davis, who was one of the opponents of Sheikh Anta at the colloquium, yet he had to write this in the conclusion. I quote, although the preparatory working paper sent out by UNESCO gave particulars of what was expected from everybody, every participant, not all participants had prepared communications comparable with the painstakingly researched contributions of Professor Sheikh Anta Diop and Théophile Obenga. And as a result, there was consequently a real lack of balance or an imbalance in the discussion. So this is whom we are talking about. He received many distinctions, awards. His work reflecting a careful scrutiny and profound knowledge of Africa, its history, the realities of its peoples, etc. And he has made two contributions with the establishment of two assertions in the area of historiography and anthropology. The first one is about Africa as a cradle of humankind and human civilization. And the second is about the profound cultural, anthropological, and linguistic unity of African peoples, despite specificities and even differences. To that leads to a number of related research teams that we will come back afterwards. Diop's political strategy being based on a vision of the future, as we can see in his book, Economic and Cultural Base for a Federal State, published in 1960 and republished in 1974. Diop's work was a work with purpose. As emphasized by José do Nascimento, if Diop's purpose was to lay out the scientific foundations for the consolidation of an all-African political and historical conscience, the major concern of his work aims at the creation of objective conditions for the renaissance of Africa as a scientific, technological, as well as an economic and political pole of initiative and decision-making in the world of today and tomorrow. This has methodological implications. The first one being the advocacy for conceptual independence and maturity, but also at synchronic level, given the fundamental unity among African societies and peoples, therefore, it is impossible to understand and let alone explain any part of Africa in its own respect out of its global continental context. And from a diachronic or historical viewpoint, a dialectical movement is necessary between contemporary African and Egyptian antiquity, insofar as this intellectual journey makes it possible to understand many aspects of African contemporary societies. It provides also an opportunity to overcome what Theophile Obenga calls the anarchic dispersal of contents, because the dominant intellectual productions are essentially case studies and monographs, and we don't really pay great attention to the production of building theoretical models. We are still dependent on the exterior. We are still in the colonial pact, to use a concept that has been developed and analyzed by Paulin Huntonji. Scientific relevance provides a new framework and scheme for the analysis and interpretation of the relations between African and other world peoples, because Africans, knowing what their contribution have been to world history and civilization, then they would look at themselves and at the world and at other people and at their relationships in a different way. It is important, finally, to insist that Job's legacy is a living legacy. It's not a work that is there to be adored, contemplated. No, it's being perpetuated, critiqued, expanded as a school of thought, that is Africology, by many different authors like Abu Bakr Musa Lam, Leonard Jeffries, Doron Karenga in the diaspora, but also Dani Wadada Nabudere, Charles Finch, Aike Arma, etc., etc. Job's work is also characterized by transdisciplinarity. Generally, when we talk of transdisciplinarity, we tend to think chronologically of the 2002 manifesto on transdisciplinarity by Basarab Nicolescu. But as early as the 50s, let us not forget that Job was grappling with the creation of a value-laden knowledge reflecting the African worldview, which led him to move between Egyptology, anthropology, linguistics, nuclear physics, biochemistry, and paleontology, etc. So Job was not speaking about transdisciplinarity, he was practicing transdisciplinarity. The vision of the future and the logical availability of the mind, these are concepts that Job reaches at the end of his intellectual journey in his book, Civilization or Barbarism, as a result of his reflection on transdisciplinarity. So finally, what is the relevance of the Dakar School to the Southern Africa higher education, to humanities, etc.? First, in the Africanization of curricula, for obvious reasons. For that, Job's works and the works from Dakar and other schools, of course, I'm speaking of Dakar because that was the content of my paper, needs to be disseminated to fill a number of gaps in a perspective of transformation and refoundation of the epistemology of humanities and social sciences, with implications for curriculum reform, enhanced pedagogy, and the production of relevant and quality didactic materials and applications in the areas of, for instance, language planning and early childhood education and development. And of course, the general history of Africa, the 9 volumes, 8 plus 9, the 9 is dedicated to the diaspora, needs to be used. This is a treasure that is there, but it is not being taken advantage of. Towards an alternative pedagogy. Thank you so much. Towards an alternative pedagogy project, which needs to be comprehensive and holistic, as in African Africa, with the principle of Shemsu being one of the critical principles, being Shemsu, a corporate approach to learning, to teaching, something like a collective journey. Of course, mother tongue-based multilingual education needs to be paid attention to, but also we need to go beyond the distinction, the artificial distinction between literature and orature, as we have been invited by Patejan in Senegal, who speaks about mbirikel ak khalat, that is the things of the spirit and the mind, but also Mbulelo Vizikungo Mzamani, writing from a Nguni perspective. We need a paradigm shift. And for that, we need to search and build and find an institutional space for the study of Southern African and African indigenous languages and knowledge systems. This would, of course, contribute to end the relative epistemological and intellectual insularity that I have mentioned earlier. It's about, in a word, taking Southern African scholarship to Africa, to the diaspora and the global world, while bringing African diaspora as well as global scholarship into Southern Africa. We need to empower ourselves, going back to the African school. First, we need to learn to read in hieroglyphics, demotic, hieratic, which are ancient African writing system. And there is here treasures of knowledge, but we cannot access them because we do not need them. There is a need to opt for what Obenga calls a paradigm of intentional sciences. We need to assess Job's work, but also Marxist epistemology and their impact. We need platforms for an open, constructive debate on scholarly matters to supersede the debilitating impact of a pervasive culture of entrenched academic territoriality and monodisciplinarity in order to bridge the gaps between those three sources of knowledge that I have mentioned earlier. We need finally—
Prof, we need to conclude.
Yes, I'm concluding. That's my last point. That's my last point. There is a need to investigate and operationalize African indigenous knowledge systems and discourses. As Patejanya emphasized it, as ancestors of humankind and civilization, Africans have built not only institutions, but they have also produced discourses about their own practices. So we need to rediscover such discourses, you know, with their registers and their principles and their objectives. For Patejanya, the African continent is home to a history of knowledge as old as time, and whose singularity should be stressed not in terms of a racial phenomenon, but rather as a purely cultural and historical one. Obviously, there are differences, there are even conflicting interests and contradictions, but it is possible to retrace through space and time and to reconstruct the continuity and the coherence of such African thought. Let us also remember the permanence of the same scientific spirit in African societies, in post-pharaonic African societies. Therefore, and this is my conclusion, it's not my conclusion, this is Patejanya, to contend building a theory of life, liberation and development, of democracy, of social progress, while ignoring such African national thought and knowledge would be the same as, quote, digging under our own feet a vacuum of several millennium which could be filled by no political or scientific dissertation, learned and brilliant as such a dissertation might be. With this, I would like to thank you for your patience and for having given me the floor. Thank you, Professor Motala.
Thank you very much, Prof. Samba. I wish we had a whole day to listen to these rich presentations, but now I will thank you so much. That was a great presentation and raised so many issues. I think they already in the chat and in the question and the Q&A. I now want to hand over to our esteemed Professor Falola, who can now proceed. Thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you. And I would like to start by thanking Professor Motala for chairing this and for the Institute for organizing this. They've been organizing so many great events. And their director, the distinguished professor, writes some very great weekly pieces on various issues. And I think the last one is on people with disability and the Olympics. So I need to also formally thank him for those contributions to public debate. And I cannot but remember the hosting of the conference, and I'm very grateful for being there. At the same time, we must remember two participants who are no longer with us. The presenter in Kenya and the wife of one of them. We've lost two of those who were with us in that conference. May their souls rest in peace. During the conference, there was a very small fight around issues of identity. During the Q&A, I would like us to discuss the post-conference and the post-book. What are those transformations, intellectual transformations that have also taken place after the great conference and the outstanding book that emanated from it, in a sense in which some debates began there that continue to shape the academy. The task before me is to look at Ibadan, but I will do so in a larger, broader African context, which means I would sink into my own presentation some of the key ideas by the two previous speakers, so that those outside the field can benefit maximally. There was a pre-academic moment, pre the University of Ibadan, pre-Makerere, pre-Nairobi moment. And those moments were shaped by three events: the colonial contest of characterizing Africa, which people have been labeled as a moment of epistemicide, epistemological violence, epistemological erasure, in which the people, the institutions, their history were undermined. That is a great contest, whether for the paper in Uganda or for the paper on the great Cheikh Anta Diop, a pioneer of extraordinary distinction. Then there were other forms of writing which emerged. In these other forms of writings that emerged, we had a wide variety of local chronicles, distinguished in South Africa, distinguished in West Africa, Reynolds, Samuel Johnson. They were writing, and they were writing to attack that colonial project. We have to thank them. But the most slighted in all our conversation, they are forever slighted, were Black organic intellectuals before African universities were created. We don't thank them enough. And I will isolate only one person, W.E.B. Du Bois. The framing of Africa that we use today was made possible by Du Bois, rejecting the Leo-Africanus, rejecting the Bilad al-Sudan characterization by the Arabs. In the World and Africa, a book that should be translated to as many languages as possible, Du Bois was the one who later framed what African scholars were doing. Merge North Africa with, do not separate Egypt and North Africa. The argument that Cheikh Diop affirmed very well, that when you say Africa south of the Sahara, that was a Washington, D.C. racialized category. And Du Bois laid out the very topics that we began to pursue, whether it's on Kush, on Mali, on Egypt, on the pyramids. They were laying the foundation for us before we established Ibadan or Makerere or Legon. We don't thank them, but we cannot thank them enough. Then came the Second World War. In all the two previous papers, the transformation after the Second World War, locate all of them in the major context. There were era of great reforms, the late colonial moments. The British were reforming, the French were reforming. They were talking about economic planning. They set up committees to review the education system and decided to say they will establish universities. The reason is if they did not undertake reform after the Second World War, they're going to lose control. Two major superpowers had emerged, the Soviet Union and the United States. Both of them did not have colonies in Africa. They had their own agenda. The US was interested, was salivating about a big African market if the colonial empire could crumble. And the Soviet Union was salivating about the possibility of spreading the socialist ideology. The Europeans had to go, but before they did that, they were beginning to introduce reforms. In an era of great radicalism, a new generation of Africans saying, we do not want reforms, we want you to live. And that supplied the context for the intellectual production of the 1950s, whether it's Legon, Nairobi, Makerere, in other places outside, other than in South Africa. So that was a contest. By the time the University of Ibadan was created, there was the organic contribution by Du Bois. It was in the context of radicalism. And what did they do? They turned scholarship into the era of decolonization. To do what? To create what they call an African perspective. So African perspective of sociology, African perspective of history, African perspective of politics. And when you accumulate all these perspectives, they created institutions to make scholarship possible, create the archives that were not there before, reform the departments, move it away from Eurocentric teaching and research to an African-based teaching and research. And they emphasize issues around methodology. Pamela raised the issue of oral tradition. Our great friend, Samba, raised the issue of alternative epistemologies. We should not confuse both of them, but they fuse both of them. In the case of Professor Buri, was laying emphasis on epistemology, and the case of Pamela on methodology. And when you fuse the epistemology with the methodology, they began to produce new ontologies around the density of historical narratives that focused on the pre-colonial moments, the African agency of transformation, the capacity of Africa to generate leadership values. Note in all these works, they were privileging agency and leadership. On leadership, they needed to do that because the colonial narrative was that Africans were incapable of governing themselves. Those of you in South Africa must have heard this so many times. In the 50s, Africans were hearing what we were later to hear after 1994, and they were focusing on indigenous institutions. When you cumulate pre-colonial history, Du Bois asked us to do that. The African agency, it became the Europeans do not exaggerate your contribution. It was Africans who converted themselves into Christianity. It was Africans who spread Islam. It was Africans who ran the former colonial economy. It was Africans in the police, Africans in the army. And you cannot say we could not govern ourselves. And if you look at the African historical period before Christ, a long historical period before Christ, Ethiopia was one of the biblical states. Axum, by 1st century AD, it was there. Till 7th century, replaced by Sagwe. They were using ontologies to make critical epistemological points. And then when you accumulate all the points they were making, they were connecting knowledge to nation building. We don't do that as much as that anymore. Now, diaspora intellectuals, for instance, they are no longer converting these disciplines into agency of nation building. They were now converting them to so-called theories that they want to validate. But all these early writers that my two previous speakers mentioned, they were connecting knowledge to the project of the nation building and of nation states. Second, they began to see Africanity as a nationalist project. Diop did that, as Buri emphasized remarkably well. So nation building project, Africanity as a nationalist project. So they were not just creating knowledge, they were talking about the idea of a usable past, and the ideas of a usable knowledge. The past you can use, the knowledge you can use. Today, I'm afraid we don't do that anymore. I don't want any 2 minutes notice. I won't give you the opportunity to do that. So let me conclude by saying that we can rework some of these assumptions in Makerere, in Ibadan, in Legon, Chikanta Diop into the following 5 points. And this is the only time I'll be drawing from the essay in the book. We should teach continental and national African history all over Africa, all over the colleges, and try to convert them into textbooks for high schools. Second, that African historical perspective, irrespective of how you define it, whether it's AIK, whether it's Chekanta Diop, whether it's about local scholars, must be at the center of many of the things we teach. We must also not exclude other parts of the region into what we teach. We must draw values where we can get values from. Ideas of bureaucracy from China, idea of Hinduism and what it does for state buildings from India, ideas of capitalism from the US, ideas of blending culture, knowledge, technology from Japan, and many other places where we can learn useful values. We must ensure that the history of economics, science, industrialization, technology are blended with the way we create ontologies. And finally, we must rescue whatever is left, and to the extent that is possible, as Buri mentioned, indigenous knowledge, non-archival knowledge systems, so that in the final analysis, we create what I call a pluriversalist way of thinking, a pluriversalist way of thinking. We are not just appendages to universalist way of thinking. We create our own local ideas, we convert them into theories, and we spread them into what others can use, irrespective of their location in the world. Thank you once again, Professor Adebayo and his colleagues and the Institute. You will continue to grow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof Pamela, and for calling me into account. I didn't have to give the time issue, but that was a really important and forward-looking presentation about how we need to draw on the global and the local to create our own knowledge and ontological base. We have about 35 minutes for questions. I'm going to ask you to put up your hands and we'll take them in rounds of questions, but there are a few already in the question and answers. I'm going to read them quickly. I think the first one is for Prof Pamela, and it was really about where she ended, where she left us with something of a teaser and a taster when she raised the issue about transformation, and she asked whether, and the question that's being posed by Frank Bonowale is it fair to say that transformation consists of the number of staff members working in an academic realm, or rather consists of the creation and appropriation of our own African epistemologies? I think you raised the issue about the transformation being a political project, and that was insufficient. It had to be related to issues of social inequality and other things as well. And then to Prof Buri, I'm just going to raise these together, and then we can you can respond. From Prof Naren Bejnath, he asks, are we not trapped in a paradox, attempting to mitigate the dominance of the Western canons of knowledge that triumphed because dominant during the colonial period and whose residual impact we still deal with today, while attempting in the current post-colonial period to find space in the very dominant discourses for African and other marginalized voices? If you agree, how do we overcome this conundrum in this view? If you don't agree with my characterization, how would you characterize it? And then from Prof Mnet. These are all colleagues from South Africa. His question is, he has a long question there, and possibly Prof Falola can answer that. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but his question is, beyond the conceptual rhetoric, which kinds of practical actions contemporary institutions in Africa and elsewhere should take to actually truly decolonize African higher education systems and the curriculum? And I think Prof Falola was actually beginning to answer that question in his concluding comments. So I will start off with Prof Pamela for comments, but I also will be looking for colleagues who've put up their hands. So Prof Pamela, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Motala, and thank you very much, Frank, for the question. I actually take it more of a statement than a question, because you're really spot on. That transformation is more about the developing our own African epistemologies. And I think what I was doing in my case, as I did point out, that so some scholars have highlighted that if you want to think about Africanization or transformation, not that I'm using the two interchangeably, but that we have to think about different aspects of the university. And so in my case, I was trying to point out that in the area of staffing, this was what was happening. And but the point being that you can have that. You could have more. You could have Africans appointed, but not necessarily transforming the curriculum. And so in that case, then you still have the question of what it takes. And that's where I think that it's more about the will, about the deliberate intention to transform, to promote African epistemologies, and less about who is actually doing it. But of course, in the politics of the 60s, there was a lot. There was a lot going on. Histories of other departments where the European staff that had existed up to that point were nearly asked to set parking so that you have Africans take up the position. But so my point is that yes, you could have them, you can have the Africans come in, but if they cannot think about promoting the African epistemologies, then there's really no transformation. I hope I answered that question. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'll hand over now to Prof. Buri.
Thank you. Two questions are not specifically directed at me. Decolonizing and transformation. And I would like to actually relate this question to the project of the Institute. So I don't know whether all of us are on the list of Professor Adebayo's public-oriented contributions. Is decolonizing and transforming. I'm just giving an example to relate to what is going on. Is decolonizing and transforming all the time. That's a great example. That's a great example. So there's a series of seminars on the pantheons of Pan-Africanism. I apologize I've not been able to join. That's decolonizing. And there is essays on the Olympics, on great actors in history, on so many issues, yes, in which that's a different book. There's the African,
yes, I know.
There's another book on the Pantheon. That's the very institute itself is decolonizing and transforming at the same time. So the reason why I'm using that is that they're already doing some of these things. So how can we now expand on those things? in the following ways. Those of us who have the privilege of supervising PhDs, we must always ask them that question. What are your contributions to this decolonizing project to Africanity, to issues of transformation? What are you contributing? Second, a review of how we teach and all our syllabi. What is the mission? What do we want the student? What is the takeaway at the end of the semester for the students? And finally, we should not disconnect what we do in the classrooms from, when possible, if possible, practical day-to-day activities. So when I was a consultant with the International Institute of African Affairs in Lagos, it was a think tank. So we came up with the idea that you can't say this is Africa, and when people come, diplomats are visiting, heads of states are visiting, you are giving them Western food. You're going to say they should be able to drink palm wine from palm tree. They should be able to eat pounded yam with melon soup. Those are practical projects. In other words, don't let us disconnect what we're talking about from the day-to-day organic reality. So I've fleshed out all these ideas in various ways, starting from your center that you're already doing many of these projects and keep doing them. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Bejnat, who was a colleague, I think that's Professor Nairant Bejnat, who was a colleague at UNISA. I am not sure whether, I'm not sure I have understood fully his question, because it was quite, it was rather a contribution and a question at the end. So what I understand is about how to make that paradigm shift. That's how I understand it, Professor Motala. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes. No, that's
more or
correct.
less. Okay, so I'm not going to provide a full answer, but let's say elements of answer to that. First, I think that there is a need, as I said, to craft an institutional space for that, because if you do not have the institutions, you cannot succeed. So institution building is part of it. So coming back to Professor Bejnat, what can be done against the high mortality institutional rate that occurred at UNISA? I can quote some of the very promising institutions at UNISA, but that died, you know, and how we need to unpack to discuss about that. One is the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute. There is also the Ashimafeje Institute, the Institute of African Renaissance Studies, where I was, the Academy of African Languages and Science that I had the privilege to manage for 3 years. All those institutions are gone now. So how do we explain that? So that is one, the institution, build the institutions and make sure to maintain them. And if they fail, we need to have clarity on why they failed and why they were destroyed. That is one. The second thing is about work in the area of this issue of put an end to insularity. I was talking about the epistemic insularity in Southern Africa. For instance, in the area of comparative and historical linguistics, many colleagues, including distinguished colleagues in Southern Africa, when they talk about the culture, the linguistic map of Africa, are using the taxonomy established by Greenberg since 1963, where, among other families, he speaks of an Afro-Asiatic family, which is a linguistic ghost. It does not exist. So this is one of the proofs of epistemic insularity that we need to work on. And of course, as I said, we need to learn in all our universities to have the possibility to learn how to read and write in demotic in hieroglyphics and in hieratic, which are in which very precious knowledge has been written and kept. And for the time being, it does not speak to ourselves. And of course, mainstreaming the legacy, the epistemic legacy of Cheikh Anta Diop and Africology as an alternative paradigm for knowledge production and application. So I don't want to speak too much. So these are elements of answers and not the answer to your question, Professor Bejat. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Prof Puri. There was a second question which was in the chat, which was that I think it was Mr. Wanted you to speak a little more on alternative multilingual pedagogy, if you want to, because the issue of language continues to be an area that preoccupies all of us and is a big indication of the decolonial past still continuing to exist in the present. So yeah, if you want to talk just about...
To me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, well, again, elements of answers. And very shortly, you see ACALAN, the Academy or the African Academy of Languages, which is an institution of the African Union, has said something that is very, very, very relevant. In the area of language planning, of mother tongue based education, in many, 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 many areas, we need, if we want to be successful, to do 2 to 3 things. The first one I've spoken about is to build the institutions. Secondly, to build the capacities. And thirdly, to allocate the resources in order to do that. And finally, to have a legislation, a framework, a normative and regulatory framework. Now, and that is my final word about it. Almost everything has been discussed and said about how to institutionalize the teaching of our languages. But it is in the drawers. We need to take them out of the drawers and implement them. So implementation is the key issue if we wanted to promote our languages.
Thanks very much, Prof. Puri. I'm going to ask, there's another question, and I have one to add there. There's a question from Camille Anderson, and it's a question to all the presenters. He asks, given the vast size and diversity of Africa and this centuries-long history and pervasivity of colonization, can all the presenters reflect on what they perceive as the actual time frames of decolonization, African history and education? Just how long do they think this process was going to take? Well, I'm not sure if that's a question that has an answer, but I wanted to ask a related question, and maybe presenters can just, in the current context, particularly in the COVID and during the pandemic, what has been foregrounded in education very strongly is the issue of social inequality and who has access to resources in order to access quality learning, manage the online turn, etc. And I think it goes back to Pamela's point that while we have had, what is the relationship between political equality and social inequality? And maybe that is the big issue that we continue to face and bedevils both the transformation and the decolonization project. But there's a sense that unless we have a more equitable dispensation for all, higher education will continue to be the preserve of a few. We have a very stratified higher education system of who gets access to what, both within the country and outside of the country. So yeah, it's a question about political equality and social. But possibly I'll start with Prof Falola, and if you just want to answer those 2 questions, around how long it's going to take. And secondly, around inequality. I think Prof Falola, it also relates to the points you were making around African epistemologies and diversity of knowledge bases we need to actually contribute to create something our own. Maybe if you just want to speak to all of that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Motala co-panelists and members of the audience for your interest and engagement. Decoloniality, transformation, I won't put it as if there's a time frame to end them. I will pursue it differently, that every generation, every moment, every era has to do transformation, this decolonizing, their own way. So we're just thinking for the moment, 2021, I'll be lucky if I'm still here in 10 years' time. So another generation will revisit it. The Yoruba have a proverb that what we call knowledge today is madness tomorrow. What they're saying in that proverb is that we build on the past, but every generation has to renew itself. Remember, Wimo Blyden came, African for Africans, Senghor came, Negritude, other generation came, Frantz Fanon came, Radicalism, my generation came, other generations follow. And this project of transformation will never end. This project of decolonization will never end because we are building. We are standing on the shoulders of giants. We are building on collective achievements. We are building on the past. And as we build on them, we reinvent ourselves. There will come a moment when Africa will become so technologically developed. They will be able to transform many of what we call juju and myths into modern technologies. That's transforming. Shango, the fourth Alaafin of Oyo, centuries and centuries ago, the Yoruba invented a god who knew about electronics, physics, macromagnetics, and things like that. He was spitting fire from his mouth. That was a conception of knowledge of the time in this great empire. Subsequent, this was even before the age of electricity in Western world, which they conceive of those ideas. So these ideas will keep coming. As to issues around equality, thanks for bringing that up. There's something they call code in the US. If you say, Falola, give me your address, they will say, what's your zip code? 78681. Zip codes are part of structured racism. Whoever knows that zip code basically knows your income level, knows what you can afford. If you take your car to the mechanic to fix, the mechanic says, what's your zip code? He already knows how much to bill you, because those zip codes are not just to distribute letters. They are also to understand privileges and inequalities in society. What COVID has done, it has revealed that there is third world in the first world, that things that you take for granted that others have, it now even revealed that not everybody has access to the internet, not everybody has access to computer, and not everyone, even if you give computer and email addresses to some people, they don't even know how to use it. And that this is something we have to work on. Whatever is possible, we must do with our limited resources, providing access to our students. But in the final analysis, it is a political question. It's a political question. And you see it in SARS protests in Nigeria, Zambia, and other countries, that young people are venting. They're saying they're tired of these inequalities. They're tired of collecting degrees without job opportunities, and they're venting. And sometimes these vents get into the streets and acted as violence. And those of you in South Africa, you've had your own shared dose of these violent expressions.
Thanks very much, Prof Pamela. I'm going to go to Prof Pamela for some comments on the two issues that Mr. Anderson has made.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Matala. I don't really have anything very different from what Professor Falala said, because I think that for as long as we have the inequality between the global north and the global south, the decolonization project is something that will just be ongoing, because we're struggling with different things at different moments. And so if we are thinking of, so if we work so hard to try to decolonize the way we teach, things are moving very fast. And so with all these technologies, for example, would we take, given the circumstances that we are in right now, would we take online, where would we position online learning? Should we be opposed to that as something that is coming from wherever, or is it something that fits in the circumstances? So I think that both, even in terms of knowledge, that different things come up at different times. And so for me, my sense is that as long as we have the inequality, I think that this is something that is really ongoing. And the comment about inequality, I mean, the pandemic and social inequality that you raised, Dr. Motela, I mean, you put it perfectly. My own university in Uganda is really, we are really having that problem, because not every student, for example, can afford to buy themselves a laptop or have a smartphone, and yet they are expected to write their exams electronically and submit to the university e-learning environment. And so what is likely to happen is that those who are not able, who either don't have the gadgets, or even if they have the gadgets, maybe they don't have the money to buy data, or they live within localities with a very poor internet connection, will definitely be affected. I know that some of the private universities here have been teaching, and their point is that the university doesn't close. Whether just 10% of the students are able to study online, that is okay. We shall proceed with those who can afford. And so the pandemic, I think, is only made the already bad situation worse. And this is really going to impact on the kind of scholarship, but also the dropout rate of students, or would be upcoming academics. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Prof Pamela. I'm going to ask Mr. Kamili just to make a brief input, and then we'll take Prof Buri after that.
Again, I am just asking again, I'm trying to embellish my question somewhat, to ask more specifically, how massive is this project to decolonialize the education and the history of African civilizations, societies, and how do they perceive how massive this project is, and how committed are their institutions to the long haul of this? The challenges and the triumphs, the potholes in the road, the floods of information to counter their arguments. How committed are they to this process, this project? Thank you very much. And it's Ms. Anderson.
Thanks very much. Sorry for getting the gender wrong. Thanks very much. Prof Buri, I'm going to hand over to you, and if you could also just answer the questions and make your concluding comments, and then I'll wind my way back to Prof Pamela and Prof Falola.
Thank you so much. Look, it's difficult to indicate or to fix a time frame because you see, trajectories of history are neither uniform nor linear, Yes. Sometimes, history goes very fast, and sometimes, it's very slow in terms of pace. It's stammers sometimes, and all of a sudden, due to a conjunction objective and subjective factors, you know, there is an acceleration, you know, sometimes vertiginous acceleration that produces a quantum leap. As far as I'm concerned, looking at the situation in which Africa finds itself, there are signs that a quantum leap, meaning qualitative change, cannot be overruled. It depends on how things are being done. Regarding in this, the issue, the main issue, I think, is the issue of leadership. There is one issue that we need to sort out in Africa. And if we sort it out, I think that we stand a chance for that quantum leap. Leadership, both intellectual leadership, political leadership, but also community, corporate leadership, etc. There is a crisis of leadership, actually, and we need to address it very, very seriously. Crisis of leadership or lack of leadership. But it is being handled and responded to through processes, you see, and that is my second point. You know, change is not something that happens overnight. Change is an accumulative process. Things are changing in Africa, things are being transformed, but it requires a time for these little things to add the one to each other in order to produce qualitative change. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm optimistic. Now, in the area of epistemology, because we are in the area research, knowledge production, scholarship, I think that we need to claim our epistemological independence and sovereignty back. How to do it? We have proposed a number of solutions. We have said a number of things, but there are other things that others have said. We need to put that together in order to claim our sovereignty back. And for that, there is, as I said from the beginning, the need to have platforms of dialogue, sources of knowledge. For instance, here in Senegal, I will give you one example from the Arabo-Islamic space. It is a book called Diaou Nayiraini that was published by Elhaj Ahmed Dem from Sokone, one of the intellectual centers, because we have many intellectual centers. It's not only Timbuktu. Timbuktu is maybe the tree behind which, you know, we can find the forest. So in that book is a 30-volume commentary of the Quran that has been published, and it is an interdisciplinary work. In it, you find references to both Ruhul Bayan, esoteric school, and Tantawi. And in the area, we find it, of course, we find there astronomy. He speaks of astronomy, but not only. There is notions in physical and chemical sciences, geocentric and heliocentric theories of Galileo concerning the solar system, Lavoisier's theories on matter, mineralogy, study on electric energies emanating from lightning and the mechanism of the lightning rod, chromaticism, in particular, the phenomenon of the rainbow, history of aviation, geology, volcanology, seismology, you name them. This is a 30-volume work, and these people have been doing research at a time when there was no internet. So one wonders, how did they manage to produce such a quality knowledge? So we needed that on those platforms. We need on those platforms the representatives from the traditional African space of knowledge production of application. In the area of COVID, and I will end up in there, there are a number of responses, of African responses, that are not always well documented or taken advantage of. The youth, African youth, have been inventing, including here in Senegal and elsewhere in Cameroon, etc., not only solutions in the area of medication or, you know, prevention, etc., but also breathers, etc., etc. So it is necessary to have the leadership that can pay attention to that and see how to organize it, to put it at the service of a collective project of reclaiming back our sovereignty. Because beyond the epistemological sovereignty, what is at stake is Africa's sovereignty, you know, to be reborn as an alternative space, an independent alternative space for knowledge production, but also for decision making in the world of today and tomorrow. So these are a few elements of answers, to the question. And thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Prof. Samba. Prof. Pamela, any concluding comments from your side?
Thank you, Dr. Matala, once more. So I think there was a question of how massive is the project and how committed your institutions, I guess our institutions, would be my institution in my case. And I think, I don't want to, I highlighted the idea of the different contexts, and I think that might determine how massive the project might be, and that also there might be some cases where the decolonization project doesn't sink that deep for some because of the kind of experiences that they've had. But then I would want to say that at my university, yes, there are efforts. To try to decolonize, especially in in the humanities and social sciences where I belong. But I can't say it is sort of like the main thing that, for example, when you go to teach, that is the first thing that comes to your mind. But we're all working for to provide space for African agency, and to say when we're studying this, there should be a difference from what what the colonial sort of tradition was, and so there's. We insist at least in imploring upon our students the importance of the African agents and the role and the place of the Africans in all this. And so I think that really it's something that we need different approaches. But as I've said, that it might be more forceful in us in some places than others, or some people using more force, sort of radicalism, and this is really going to carry. That's what I can say for now. But of course, also the other thing is the challenges and the pressure that you feel, and you feel sometimes as people belonging to a particular discipline where there's a lot of political talk, against the humanities, and sort of demonizing them and how they are useless and how they are irrelevant. And that sometimes also affects, that also sometimes I think affects the energy and the forcefulness that some people might put in all this. But it's a struggle, and the struggle continues.
Thanks very much, Prof. Pamela. We're coming to the end, and I hope the panelists and everybody else have read. There's a set of rich questions. I'm not sure if we'll have time. We don't have time to go through all of them. But I just, by way of conclusion, want to make a couple of comments, which I think bring together everything that we've discussed. And I was intrigued by the question about the time frames, because we don't often think of it in that way. But I think the things that I've learned from our panelists today and from you, the audience, is that transformation is complex, multi-layered, and really we are in a new historical epoch. I think in the book, there's a richly presented chapter by Ahmed Bawa, where he argues quite critically that tertiary institutions produce the foundations for new ontology and epistemology, for a more complete liberation in African and American societies, which I think is the point, that which post-colonial societies have not so far produced. I think the current debates and discussions provide a new set of foundations, a new set of energies that can craft new directions in knowledge production and dissemination in Africa and its diaspora. I think what I heard as well today, and I was interested in the questions, is there is a new generation of activists who are asking us about this decolonizing project, but over to you, that you have the responsibility of taking this project forward. And in some ways, I suppose the question for all of us, or the answer for all of us, is that there's no turning back. We embarked on a project of decolonization and transformation, and we need to build solutions to produce new narratives for higher education, which will also contribute to all sorts of things, caring institutions, economic growth, cross-sector alignment, and better societies for us all. So I want to end by thanking again our esteemed panelists, Prof Falola, Prof Samba, Prof Pamela, for an excellent set of debates and discussions. There wasn't enough time to enter all of these thoroughly and systematically and completely, but I would urge all of you to buy the book, which is available from Jacana Press. Yes, do read it. It takes you a lot further, takes a lot of the debates much further. Also, a big thank you to my colleagues at the Institute for Pan-African Studies, Thought and Conversation, and in particular to Prof Akinola, and a big thank you to its Executive Director, Prof Adebayo, who provides really transformative and forward-looking leadership, which allows us to be bold and put these panels together. So thanks to everybody, and good night. Have a good evening.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.